Good morning from our global headquarters in London. I'm Kriti Gupta in for Manus Cranny and Danny Berger. Welcome to Bloomberg Brief. Let's set your agenda. A Labour victory. Keir Starmer won a landslide victory in the UK general election, dramatically reshaping the political landscape. Meanwhile, stateside, it's make or break for Biden. The president heads into the most consequential weekend of his political career as pressure mounts for him to drop out of the race. Plus, it's Jobs Day in America, and today's report might just flash a warning signal for the Fed. We'll have full coverage right here on Bloomberg TV. But first, let's get to our top story here. A new Labour government is sweeping into office in the UK after winning the general election in a landslide. It ends 14 years of Conservative government rule with outgoing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak taking responsibility for his party's disastrous result. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Alex Morgan to break it all down. Alex, over to you.
Well, hello, Chrissy. Now, we've got quite a large screen here, and I've got quite large arms, but still, I'm sort of struggling really to point to the scale of this Labour win. This is a stonking great majority. This is the second largest majority we've seen since Tony Blair in 1997 for the Labour Party. I mean, really extraordinary. 412 seats. And we've seen a collapse of the governing Conservatives, the formerly governing Conservatives, dropping to 120 seats. Now, Rishi Sunak, of course, was the last Prime Minister. There have been 5 since the Conservatives took office in 2010. They've been the governing party for 14 years. Their vote collapsed. The Liberal Democrats, look at that. They are now the third force once again, another centre-left party in the UK, picking up their best ever result. North of the border in Scotland, the Scottish National Party dropping down to less than 10 seats at 9. Let's put it on a map for you and now show you the sea of red from Scotland to the southeast of England. It's a stonking great Labour win. But, Chrissy, this is key. There have been some results which point to just how dissatisfied the electorate are. A sense that this majority for Labour, if anything, is built on a sense of frustration. Frustration with the Conservatives, frustration with the status quo. The emergence of Nigel Farage's Reform Party, Farage, of course, being to the right of the Conservatives, architect of Brexit. They picked up 4 MPs and a lot of the vote share. The emergence of that party really, many seeing as a sense that voters are expressing frustration on issues like immigration, and that'll be a concern not just for the Conservatives, but for Labour. Nigel Farage making it clear that despite just getting 4 seats this time around, he has his eyes on Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. Don't think that's going to bother Keir Starmer too much today when he's sitting on such a majority. Tony Blair, of course, in 1997 picking up a majority of 179. This is just below that, and it is below what the initial polls had been suggesting, a supermajority. But still, Labour have swept the board and the Conservatives have collapsed.
A stonking Labour victory, in the words of Alex Morgan. We thank you so much for bringing us that this morning. Let's get back to Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie, who, of course, is at Downing Street. Tom, you've been covering this all morning. What is the sense at Downing Street right now?
Kriti, yes, we are waiting now for the outgoing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to make a speech. 10:30 a.m. UK time on the doorstep, of course, of 10 Downing Street, just behind me. Then Keir Starmer, the incoming Prime Minister, expected to speak at around 12 p.m. as well. Alex Morgan set it up really well in terms of the key takeaways from this election. The gains, of course, that have come through for this Labour Party and the historical reference to 1997 and the upside that saw Tony Blair take office. You haven't eclipsed that number. He took in 418 seats. You're looking at about 411 for Keir Starmer. But given the context of that 2019 vote where the Labour Party saw its biggest losses since the 1930s, it is a marked turnaround under the stewardship of Keir Starmer, soon, of course, to be our new UK Prime Minister. But then the context in terms of how widely stretched these gains are and this coalition is, and what that means as this government and the Chancellor, the incoming Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, pursues those economic ambitions, given the fiscal constraints that we know that this UK economy faces.
Tom, there's so much going on in terms of what's on the agenda for the Labour Party right now, what they're inheriting here. You have the relationship with Europe, you have house planning, you have tax policy, not to mention deregulation. What comes first out of this government?
Yeah, so the first 100 days, Kriti, as you point to, are going to be really, really crucial. And what we're hearing is that planning is going to be up front and centre. 1.5 million homes is what they want to build over this parliamentary session, so about 4 to 5 years. But they're looking to rewire the planning rules of the UK in pretty rapid succession. So we'll see the impact on that. And that's why, in terms of the equity markets, we're looking at the house builders. Then there's Great British Energy. That's going to take more time to capitalise, but there's a potential challenge there for some of the utility companies in the UK. On the labour force as well, we have 2.8 million people who are economically inactive. We know that the Labour Party, this new government, want to get those people, at least some of them, back into the workforce. Productivity remains a challenge. The debt to GDP currently close to 100%, and then the deficit as well, above 3%. So the constraints are there. They will come through with some modest spending, not as much as many on the left would like, but you should expect to see moves around planning, around Great British Energy, and around the industrial policy in the first 100 days. Then we look ahead to the autumn statement, potentially in September, maybe more likely in October for the incoming Chancellor, Rachel Reeves.
Are the markets ready for it? More importantly, is the economy ready for it? Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie at Downing Street giving us that update on the potential policy changes to look forward to ahead of this, or actually after this landslide victory. We thank you so much. Let's get over just a stone throw away from Downing Street over to our UK election debrief event happening in Westminster. Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua on location there. Fran, walk us through what the sentiment is like. What is the vibe like? What are you watching this morning?
Well, the vibe is pretty good here, and good morning, Kriti. I think a lot of people are trying to shelter from the rain. We are about 100 meters from Downing Street, and a lot of people have popped in. We have a lot of newsmakers, a lot of business people trying to understand what comes next for Labour. Well, one person who's right at the heart of this, who helps us understand, is Dave Merritt. He's our Bloomberg head of media editorial. Dave, we were inside. There's about 200 people trying to figure out exactly what the priorities for Labour are. What do they need to get done in the next 100 days to make sure that the business community, but also, chief executives know they mean business?
Yeah, that's right. Everyone's dosing up on coffee here after only a few hours sleep. And, this is where it gets real, isn't it? There wasn't much detail in Labour's manifesto, a sort of deliberate strategy to be perhaps a little vague so that it couldn't be unpicked on the sort of tax and spend questions. But we're going to have to find out when the first budget of Rachel Reeves, the incoming Chancellor of the Exchequer, we're assuming she's going to be appointed that this afternoon. What is the detail in there? What are the big gestures? We all know that the fiscal situation in Britain is very, very tight. This is not like it was in 1997, the last time we had a big Labour landslide win. Then Tony Blair and Gordon Brown had some wiggle room in the economy. They could actually spend a lot of money and invest in public services and things like education and NHS. That is not the case without some big revenue-raising measures. There are very few of those in the Labour manifesto. So that is what everyone is asking. Where are taxes going to have to go up? Is it going to be on the corporate sector? Is it going to be on personal taxation in order to give the government some firepower to actually invest in the public services, which is what they've committed to do?
So will we see a Labour Party that's quite bold? I know Keir Starmer, because of his personality, is maybe seen as careful and subdued, which is probably what markets wanted, which is why we're not seeing a lot of market reaction after some of the pretty wild years under the Tories.
Yeah, I mean, bold isn't an adjective that's normally associated with Sir Keir Starmer. And yet, who could be more emboldened by the result he's waking up to this morning? The biggest landslide in anyone's memory, the most crushing defeat for the Conservative Party in its very long history. So if that doesn't embolden him to take sort of big actions, he's got a whopping majority, and you can sit here and say, well, he can do whatever he likes. It's not really in his personality that we've understood so far to be come out the gate. He tends to look at things very carefully, come to a decision. But he has transferred in just the last 4 or 5 years since he took over. He has taken Labour from their worst defeat to one of their biggest victories. So a slow and steady approach has certainly won him the race in this case. But, now everyone wants action. We want to have a budget. We want to see where the big measures are going to come from. The markets, as you said, have taken it very much in their stride. Of course, it was pretty priced in the result. So not much reaction there. But, where all the assembled business people and people from the City of London here want to know, what is it going to mean for their companies?
Yeah, and also, so Keir Starmer said, look, he's going to grow this economy by 2.5%. I know he has quite a lot of levers. It could be through trade. It could be through industrial planning. But actually, again, the timeline of how you achieve those compared to the 2.5% target, seems hard.
Yeah, Liz Truss went for a big growth agenda. We know what happened there by doing something dramatic with tax. The markets had a convulsion. So what are his options? Now, one thing that's come up this morning in discussions is Europe. He's been a little tight-lipped on this because it's such a sensitive and toxic issue in British politics, and was blamed for their big defeat back in 2019, the question about Brexit. But there is an easy win here about resetting the relationship, arguably, with the European Union.
If the EU want to negotiate, because this is what makes me laugh. You go to Brussels and you speak to insiders, and they're like, the idea that Labour kind of come in and renegotiate is maybe far-fetched because the EU has moved on and have a couple of problems of their own.
Well, maybe the fact that they have some problems of their own and some of the leadership in France, in Germany, and economically as well, some questions there. People felt economically, or the feedback from the European side was that Brexit was a lose-lose for both sides in terms of, putting up trade barriers. So is there an incentive now that the Conservatives, who are blamed for Brexit across the European Union, have been crushed in this election, that Labour, and of course remember, cast our minds back to the Brexit debate, Keir Starmer was arguing for Britain to stay initially in the single market. Now, could that question rise up again? There would be an instant boost to companies' trading activity if that were the case. Now, I'm not suggesting he's about to come out and say that this morning, but a different approach. We've seen a thawing of ties under Rishi Sunak, of course, a thawing of tensions. But that process, Europe cracked open the door a little bit. But if I was Keir Starmer, you would be looking at that question this morning as something which you can chalk up a very quick win by resetting completely the attitude to Brussels.
Dave, what else? The first time that we see Keir Starmer on a global stage is actually the NATO summit in D.C. next week. We haven't really heard him talk that much about foreign policy.
We have not, and it's going to be a huge moment for him next week, setting onto the world stage. We've been listening to John Micklethwaite, the editor-in-chief, this morning, talking about the global context of this win. And you look around the world and you see the shaky foundations of many of the leaders of the NATO alliance. They're going to be sitting around that table, whereas Keir Starmer is going to walk in with this amazing longevity. He's going to be able to say, look, I have the biggest mandate for a British Prime Minister in living memory. I'm going to be around this table for a very long time. You probably can't say the same for the other people around there. Joe Biden, we know that it's a pretty perilous position he is in. We all know more about President Macron after the results on Sunday, but again, huge issues he is facing, and Olaf Scholz in Germany similarly. So suddenly he's catapulted to being one of the more stable leaders on the global stage. That's not something that that's not a position Britain's prime ministers have had over the last few years.
Dave, what happens to the Conservative Party? So because of Nigel Farage and Reform actually doing much better than expected, does that bring maybe the Conservative parties to the right, or does it make more sense staying centrist?
Well, yeah, Nigel Farage has won a seat at the 8th attempt. But they don't have the sort of cluster of MPs in Parliament. They're going to have a few, and I'm sure there'll be an irritation. And their vote share is responsible for countless Tory MPs losing their seats. However, British politics, we've said it many times, is won from the centre. Elections are won at the centre, and I think you see some of the more right-wing members of the Conservative Party have lost their seats overnight. So, of course, the first thing is going to have to be, assuming Rishi Sunak steps down as leader, a leadership contest, and what groupings are left within this much, much smaller group of Conservative MPs that can coalesce around a leader. Remember, it's also down to the Conservative membership who leads the party in the end. So there's a huge amount of unknowns in that. I think everyone's going to have to look at the makeup of the remains of the Conservative Party in Parliament to see what sort of Tory leadership or opposition is going. But remember, in the campaign, Nigel Farage was talking about him replacing the Conservatives at the opposite. We're nowhere near that happening. They've got 4 maybe MPs that are going to be in Parliament. So, the Conservatives will dust themselves off. They're a 300-year-old political machine. And from the wreckage of last night, something will emerge over the coming days and weeks.
We don't know with how much infighting in between, but Dave, thank you so much. Dave Merritt, there, of course, our Bloomberg head of media editorial. With that, Critty, I'm going to send it back to you in the studio, and we'll have plenty more throughout the day from Westminster.
Francine Lockwood there, as she said, with David Merritt walking through some of the implications and nuances in the UK political space. Coming up, we're going to see how all that applies to the markets. Valentin Marinov of Credit Agricole joins me talking about the moves in cable. Does it sustain? We're going to get to that next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Kriti Gupta in London, filling in for Manus Cranny and Danny Berger. Now, the pound is strengthening, adding to its longest winning streak in 4 years as the Labour Party sweeps to power in the UK general election. Now, look, this is a landslide victory for Labour. This is a historic moment after 14 years of Conservative rule. How are the markets taking it? Valentin Marinov joins me, the head of G10 FX Research and Strategy over at Credit Agricole. A pleasure to have you on the program.
Good morning.
Good morning. Let's start with this cable strength. Look, it's been a fairly complacent morning when it comes to the move in the pound as well. But we've been seeing this over and over again for the past couple of days where uncertainty and volatility around the world on both sides of the Atlantic is resulting into moves into the pound, calling it a safe haven, a sign of stability, which is strange. I'm old enough to think cable used to be compared to an emerging market currency. What happened?
Yeah, it may be tempting. I see where you're going with that. It is the case that, especially with euro sterling, as in the pound versus the euro, I mean, the pound is likely to continue to have that relative appeal of the safer, heaven there. It is the case that following the Labour victory we just had overnight, the political outlook in the UK would be for much more political stability, which is the polar opposite of what could be the outcome or the consequence of the French election over the weekend. So from that point of view, I think euro sterling could remain under pressure. As a matter of fact, we are now gradually approaching the trend, or indeed the range that we've been trading before the EU referendum in essentially 2016. So ultimately, that divergence in the view of the euro now seen as the riskier one than the pound ultimately could push us lower. Still, that is part of our central case as well for euro sterling. We expect to move towards 84 and ultimately 83 in the coming months. And a big part of that would be in the UK, the period of political stability that we expect will come after last night's election.
Part of that political stability and part of the moves coming from Keir Starmer and Labour is to have those friendlier relations with Europe. I mean, they're going to be doing that very, very carefully. Is that something that pair cares about? Does the currency pair cares about?
Well, ultimately, it's about the economic impact of those. And to the extent that ultimately those help boost domestic investment, which has been hampered severely in the aftermath of Brexit, yes, that would be a sterling positive, in part because it will also make the Bank of England, which we expect to start easing before too long, but it could help the Bank of England emerge as less dovish than its regional counterparts, in particular the ECB. So all of that, again, adding to the view or corroborating our view that the pound could emerge as the best performing European currency in our forecast grid. And in the case of euro sterling, I've already mentioned some levels, but we also think that the pound could do well against other currencies like the Swiss franc and indeed really other regional counterparts there.
Let's talk about the deficits. Pick your deficit in the UK, in France, in the States. You're seeing this kind of panic show up on the long end, specifically when it comes to what some of the geopolitics and what that turmoil means for the deficit, whether it's in France, whether it's in the States. But it's not showing up as much in the FX space, despite it showing up in the bond market. Why that disconnect?
Well, it is the case that at the moment, at least, I mean, what you're referring to is a development which has a couple of important consequences. The more immediate one is growth. A big part of the resilience that we've been seeing in the US, but also in Europe, despite the persistent tightening of monetary conditions, was the fact that at the same time, governments are able to really continue to spend. What we are not seeing yet, and what you're referring to, are the negative credit effects from that. And this is where the big difference between the US and the rest of Europe could come. The fact being that populism, right, because let's face it, Rassemblement National and Trump's policies, they're quite similar when it comes to more fiscal spending. Those policies may have a completely different impact depending on the currency we are talking about. In the case of the euro, we saw what the impact has been, a euro selling. In the case of the pound, we saw in 2022 what the impact of the mini budget has been. Right? In the case of the dollar, however, being the world's reserve currency, I think that is shielding the currency and will continue to do so from the negative credit impact and continue to encourage investors to focus on the positive growth and, I would argue, inflation impact. So from that point of view, I guess, if populists populism were to ever make popular trades, that would be long dollar. This is why, going back to your point about cable, if you wish, I'm kind of struggling to buy cable here, especially given the outlook for the next 3 to 6 months, with potentially Trump winning the election, with potentially the US economy, because of that, emerging as a somewhat stronger performer compared to the UK or indeed the European economies as a whole. So from that point of view, I mean, from here, we have neutral to slightly bearish outlook on cable, but we do believe that the pound could do rather well against its European peers, the euro most notably. Yeah.
127.82 on cable, right on the cusp of 128. Valentin Marinov of Credit Agricole, we thank you so much. More ahead. This is Bloomberg. Time now for front page news. A look at what's making headlines around the world. First up, right here in the UK, the FT writing that, quote, Starmer hails a historic Labour victory as Conservatives sink to their worst ever results. The front pages across Britain are seeing red after the first change in government in 14 years overnight. Next up, the Wall Street Journal focusing on the crucial few days ahead for Joe Biden as worries mount among the Democrats. His interview later today seems increasingly crucial to those efforts. And over in France, Le Monde's front page says that France's economy is suspended ahead of the legislative vote this weekend. French national paper highlighting the prospect of political instability, generating an apprehension among economic actors in the country. Coming up, we've got Paul Donovan, Global Chief Economist over at UBS. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Brief. I'm Kriti Gupta, in for Danny Berger and Manus Cranny. Let us set your agenda. It's a Labour victory. Keir Starmer won a landslide victory in the UK general election, dramatically reshaping the political landscape. Meanwhile, stateside is make or break for Biden. The president heads into the most consequential weekend of his political career as pressure mounts for him to drop out of the race. And it's Jobs Day in America. Today's report might just flash a warning signal for the Federal Reserve. We'll have full coverage for you right here on Bloomberg Television. In the meantime, a quick check on these markets. You are seeing European indexes higher, FTSE 100 higher by 0.3%, but all eyes now on what's going on in France and the United States, not to mention the payroll story as well. That puts a lot of emphasis on Eurodollar, which is seeing strength this morning. A 108 handle on the currency pair. And, of course, futures taking its cue from what it's seeing in Europe, although slightly higher. We'll just call that flat for now, 55.92 on those contracts. Let's return to Bloomberg's UK election debrief event in Westminster. Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua on location with the business reaction to Labour's landslide win. Fran, what are you hearing?
Thank you so much, Kriti. Now, there are many questions on, of course, what Labour intends to do. This is what we know so far. Again, the counting is continuing, but almost all constituencies have been declared. Labour has notched up seats to 412, ahead of the 410 projected in the exit polls. The Conservatives have won 121, fewer than the 131 indicated. Now, many questions, of course, for businesses and policymakers. First, what do they do on the workplace? Again, there was a general agenda in the manifesto from Labour to reform, to try and make the workplace fairer. What does that mean? What does it mean for companies? Is it extra burden? A couple of other things that I think for the moment, because we have not seen much market reaction, maybe has been missed, is that with the Liberal Democrats, actually 71 MPs, their highest seats in Parliament since the party was founded, are now a pretty potent force and back as a third party of British politics. Now, we spoke to the deputy leader, and there are a couple of things, and she was laying it out very methodically about what some of the changes that they want to see. They'll, for example, pressurize Labour in Parliament on issues like the two-child benefit cap, as will the seats, or as will the Greens, who have 4 seats. Then you have a number of upsets, for example, Jeremy Corbyn and a cluster of new independent MPs that have been elected on the single issue of Gaza. So when you're Labour, you need to now really go into the details of the growth plan you want to put in place. And then, of course, on the other side, you'll have to deal with the new political forces. And then it'll depend on what happens to the Tories. I know there's a lot of relief that maybe they didn't do as badly because they're still in opposition, but also it was pretty bad in terms of the outcome. And so it'll be interesting to see how Rishi Sunak, who I believe Kriti is about to make a statement because we have that famous podium in front of probably the most famous door in the world that came out a couple of minutes ago, how he, what he says and how he positions it. I thought it was very telling yesterday that he says, it's a good thing for democracy that there's a peaceful transition of power, which should be given in our democracies, but given some of the questions over the U.S., maybe isn't.
It's a really interesting one, and as Francine pointed out, we are, of course, showing you live images, awaiting those comments from Rishi Sunak. Fran, I want to come back to you, though, because in just about 48, 72 hours' time, we'll have results across the channel as well out of France. You'll be on location there. How do you think Europe is viewing this Labour victory right now?
I think, look, if you look at a lot of the commentary and also market reaction to what happened in the UK was well telegraphed. It was, a transition after 14 years for the Conservative, and it certainly would not be seen as an upset. You can't say the same with all of the election drama in France, and you can't say the same with all of the election drama in the US, given it's going to be a big political weekend, of course, for Joe Biden. Now, over in France, against markets, maybe a little bit less anxious than they were a couple of days ago, because it now looks like Marine Le Pen's, national rally will not have a majority if you believe the polls. And if she did have a majority, there were questions on some of the things that she would put in place, such as a retirement age, some of the questions that would mean fiscal trouble ahead. Remember, if you're a market participant, what you don't want to see a repeat of is that disastrous Liz Truss budget that wasn't funded, that wasn't telegraphed to the markets because we saw the pound collapse. And so markets were very nervous going into the French election, worrying that actually Le Pen's party would do something similar. For example, tax cuts or retirement age, lowering that without being fully funded.
It's interesting that you mentioned that specifically because one of the things that the Labour Party has to do, and I think this is relevant for an international audience, some of the United States or Americans, I should say, in the States are starting to wake up to this news, Fran, is the potential for some sort of more friendly policies towards Europe. You talked about that market reaction, things like a customs union, under 30s, financial services, how that employment picture actually looks. Can you just, for the international audience, put into perspective the appetite or lack thereof within the UK to reverse some of the damage of Brexit when it comes to that European dynamic?
So, Kriti, I'm not so sure, if I'm honest. I'm a little bit on the fence of this one because we have Keir Starmer from the Labour Party that has said he wants closer ties with Europe. And there is, I think, a belief in certain parts of British politics that he can achieve that by cozying up to Europe. From the European side, and I also understand that this is how he's briefed some of the senior bankers in London and saying, look, we're going to make your life easier because if we get closer on capital markets union, if we get closer from some financial services, then we'll maybe make up for some of the things that we've lost since Brexit. But from the EU side, they've kind of moved on. I mean, it's been a couple of years, so the idea that they fully renegotiate something will take time. We did have Sir Howard Davies, the former chair of NatWest, and saying, because there's much more of an influence in France and possibly in Germany from the far right, where immigration is also taking center stage, then over the years you could see more of an alignment between the UK and countries such as France and Germany. But again, I think that would take time. The other question, Kriti, which is extremely important, is what happens to the Conservatives this morning. So they will probably cast around to see who the survivors are. They'll probably look for a new leader. We know Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman, James Cleverly are still in the mix, having held on to their seats. But this is why I think, the speech of Rishi Sunak that we're expecting any moment will be extremely telling in actually, the way forward. Then we have a little bit of pomp and ceremony. We, always enjoy looking at the pictures of the Prime Minister's car going to see the King at Buckingham Palace to then formally hand in his resignation. And when Sunak has left, Starmer will then arrive at the palace for an audience with the King as well.
All right, Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua standing by at Westminster, of course, as we wait for those comments from Rishi Sunak. All eyes on that door in Downing Street. We thank you so much. As we're awaiting those comments, let's turn for a moment to U.S. politics, because as the big event, at least for stateside, outside of payrolls, I have to say, President Biden taking in the fireworks last night at the White House as questions still surround his campaign. He is set for a high-stakes interview tonight with ABC News as he looks to silence some of his critics. Bloomberg's Rosalind Mattson watching it, I'm sure, with a bag of popcorn on this side of the Atlantic. Roz, a pleasure to have you on the program. Walk us through what's at stake here.
Well, everything's at stake for Joe Biden. Not even is he going to be a candidate, remain the candidate for the Democrats into this election. Is he going to remain US president through the end of the year? And that narrative is really building, and those questions about it. And that interview, as you say, tonight, what can he present in that interview that's going to reset that conversation? He did a radio interview yesterday on the 4th of July in the US where he had another flub. He seemingly confused himself and his vice president. So that was not necessarily a good sign. And what we're hearing, from allies across the pond, particularly in Europe, ahead of a NATO summit next week that Biden is supposed to be hosting, is a real sense of anxiety about how he's going to go hosting that meeting. And what they've been saying privately for some time, they're now increasingly saying out loud to us their real concerns about whether he's going to be, durable as a president for a second term, as a key ally for NATO, for the US, for Europe rather, and others.
And I think it's really fascinating as well, because we're talking about these institutions that are based, here. We're trying to Trump-proof to some extent, and what those odds look like. I think we're talking about a 7-8% gap in the polls right now. I think the question a lot of our audience wants to know is, does Kamala Harris, if she does indeed get swapped out with President Biden, have what it takes to beat Trump in the general election? Is that a fair swap?
Well, that's the big question. But she does have both a national presence and an international presence, more so arguably than some of the other contenders who might still be named if it does become a competition to replace Joe Biden as the Democrat candidate. So she has that standing on the international stage. She has that recognition within the US as well. Is she potentially going to be challenged on things like economic policy? I mean, she's had to not really front up on some of that, particularly face-to-face with Donald Trump as yet. We can see he's been very sort of dismissive of her in his conversation, but we know at least he's turning his attention to her because he's starting to talk about her more often in a really kind of derisory way, being Donald Trump. But she's clearly coming onto his radar. He may see her potentially as a more significant challenge than Joe Biden.
It's really interesting because even though in 2020 she didn't poll as well, she is actually polling better despite not being on the ballot over Joe Biden. Now, the question is, how much does she know about his condition? Because she's been very vocal about supporting the president. Bloomberg's Rosalind Mattson, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much. She, of course, will be, like myself, watching everything from this side of the Atlantic. Let's talk about what this all means for global economics and for markets. Paul Donovan, Global Chief Economist over at UBS, joins the program this morning. Paul, you are picking a great and a very interesting day to join the program, so thank you for making the time. Let's start with the geopolitics of all of it. We've got the UK, we've got France, we've got the United States. We've got deficit concerns, we've got geopolitical concerns. Take your pick. What keeps you up at night?
Oh, well, lots of things keep me up at night. I mean, I think one of the things that we are seeing, certainly in continental politics, I think also in US politics, is the rise of prejudice politics, where you're getting very hostile campaigns against groups in society, against immigration, against foreigners, and so on and so forth. And that comes out of a lot of the economic change. It's a natural consequence of a lot of the economic change that we have. But it's also extraordinarily damaging. Prejudice is a really negative force for medium-term economic growth. And so keeping it at bay is going to be quite important. Now, in the UK, I think there has been more success in keeping prejudice at bay, and that is potentially a more positive signal for future products.
Paul, we're going to have to leave it there briefly. We have Rishi Sunak making comments. We go to him live.
The King to offer my resignation as Prime Minister. To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters. I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss. To all the Conservative candidates and campaigners who worked tirelessly but without success, I am sorry, that we could not deliver what your efforts deserved. It pains me to think how many good colleagues who contributed so much to their communities and our country will now no longer sit in the House of Commons. I thank them for their hard work and their service. Following this result, I will step down as party leader, not immediately, but once the formal arrangements for selecting my successor are in place. It is important that after 14 years in government, the Conservative Party rebuilds, but also that it takes up its crucial role in opposition professionally and effectively. When I first stood here as your Prime Minister, I told you the most important task I had was to return stability to our economy. Inflation is back to target, mortgage rates are falling, and growth has returned. We have enhanced our standing in the world, rebuilding relations with allies, leading global efforts to support Ukraine, and becoming the home of a new generation of transformative technologies. And our United Kingdom is stronger too, with the Windsor Framework, devolution restored in Northern Ireland, and our union strengthened. I'm proud of those achievements. I believe this country is safer, stronger, and more secure than it was 20 months ago. And it is more prosperous, fairer, and resilient than it was in 2010. Whilst he has been my political opponent, Sir Keir Starmer will shortly become our Prime Minister. In this job, his successes will be all our successors, and I wish him and his family well. Whatever our disagreements in this campaign, he is a decent, public-spirited man who I respect. He and his family deserve the very best of our understanding as they make the huge transition to their new lives behind this door, and as he grapples with this most demanding of jobs in an increasingly unstable world. I'd like to thank my colleagues, my cabinet, the civil service, especially here in Downing Street, the team at Chequers, my staff, CCHQ, but most of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to my wife Akshata and our beautiful daughters. I can never thank them enough for the sacrifices they have made so that I might serve our country. One of the most remarkable things about Britain is just how unremarkable it is that 2 generations after my grandparents came here with little, I could become Prime Minister, and that I could watch my 2 young daughters light Diwali candles on the steps in Downing Street. We must hold true to that idea of who we are, that vision of kindness, decency, and tolerance that has always been the British way. This is a difficult day, at the end of a number of difficult days. But I leave this job honoured to have been your Prime Minister. This is the best country in the world, and it is thanks entirely to you, the British people, the true source of all our achievements, our strengths, and our greatness. Thank you.
All right, Rishi Sunak there on the steps of Downing Street announcing not only that he's going to be stepping down as Prime Minister with that landslide victory from Labour, but also announced that he will be quitting as the party leader. Again, this is as he departs 10 Downing Street. Those live images right in front of you. Let's bring in Paul Donovan of UBS back into the conversation. Paul, some very strong words coming from, of course, the former Prime Minister of the UK. I believe we're also due to hear from Keir Starmer pretty soon. Walk us through some of the implications that this means for, say, transatlantic geopolitics between the UK and perhaps with the United States, but also with Europe.
Well, I think with Europe, and Francine was touching on this earlier on, I mean, I think that the fact that there is no longer going to be a Conservative government in the UK, the party that took the UK out of Europe, that probably does change the tone. And some of the minor inconveniences that have sort of been in place between, Europe and the UK, these may well now be sort of smoothed over with a slightly better sense of rapprochement between the two sides. Now, I am not suggesting that, that we're suddenly going to be best friends or that the UK's joining the EU again or anything like that. Nothing like that. I mean, remember, the Labour Party has got people just as hostile to Europe as the Conservative Party has. But I think that there will probably be a change in terms of the mood. For the transatlantic relationship, at the moment, I don't think it means a great deal of shift. I think that you will see an ongoing relationship there, frankly, with a lot of foreign policy issues, particularly around Ukraine. The incoming government has very much the same views as the outgoing government. That's not going to be, I think, a particular issue. One thing I think that was interesting in the UK result, and which has some global resonance, is that it does appear that at least in certain seats, the Israel-Hamas war did have an implication. It did lead to people switching votes. Now, foreign politics doesn't normally influence elections, but maybe in a world of social media, foreign politics becomes a little bit more local. We feel a little bit more intimately involved with it. And that may be something we have to think about with other elections, including, of course, that of the United States.
All right, Paul Donovan, Global Chief Economist at UBS. We have to leave it there on this historic day in the UK. We thank you so much for your perspective on the fallout of what this new government may actually mean. Let's go next to not only the next thing on the election docket, what's happening right across the channel, and get more context on the French election. Bloomberg's Caroline Conan joins us from the annual Aix-en-Provence Economic Conference. Caroline, what is the mood there?
It's a very strange mood, Kriti. You know, usually this conference in Aix-en-Provence marks the beginning of summer. There is a positive mood, but now there is no politicians at all. None of the dozen ministers who usually come here are actually showing up, because obviously most of them are going to lose their job on Sunday. No politicians here, mostly CEOs, and a lot of anxiety on those executives' faces. Because of this uncertainty, I was talking to a CEO just now, and he was telling me there is a huge wait-and-see attitude, because even if we get a hung parliament situation on Sunday night, we don't exactly know what it's going to mean longer term in terms of some of the left-wing policies that could be put in place. As you know, the left wing is now not going to get the absolute majority, so that's one scenario that's kind of avoided for the markets. There are two scenarios remaining. One is a national rally outright majority, even though the latest polls have actually shown that this scenario is unlikely now, or less likely than it was a few days ago. One poll was showing that the national rally would get between 190 and 250 seats. The socialist Raphael Glucksmann has been warning, though, that this shouldn't be a done deal. We should be very careful, or France might just wake up with a huge hangover. Now, the reason why the national rally victory is more unlikely than it was a few days ago is because of this. This is happening in Aix-en-Provence. This is happening in many constituencies across the country. Duels between a national rally and either a left-wing candidate or a Macron candidate. Before, you had a lot of three-way contests, but more than 200 candidates have now pulled out of the race, so there's a lot of duels across the country. Participation will be key. If there is low participation, actually this increases the chances of having a national rally government. But you know, even though Emmanuel Macron has been criticized, everyone knows here that he's put a lot of emphasis on a reform business, pro-business agenda over the past 7 years. So everybody here in Aix-en-Provence is very worried that this could be over on Sunday. A lot of uncertainty for these executives, whether it's the tourism sector, the banking sector, the construction sector, a lot of anxiety here in Aix today.
All right, Caroline Conan there from Aix-en-Provence talking to us about that mood between some of the business executives and what they're seeing in the French government. Of course, we also know that there will be plenty of other interviews later today from Aix. She'll be speaking with Eurogroup President Pascal Donovan, former Brexit Commissioner for the EU, Michael Barnier, as well, to digest all the political action in Europe this week. We should also mention very quickly that as we talk about that relationship between the French government and those business executives, Marine Le Pen has been very active in trying trying to get them onto her side. She's also been trying to see where she aligns herself in broader European politics, which brings us to some confirmation here from the Hungarian government that Viktor Orban is going to be meeting Vladimir Putin. He has just landed in Moscow. This comes after Charles Michel has actively asked him and other diplomats as well to not represent the EU. And of course, Hungary had taken over the EU presidency for 6 months, that rotating presidency starting of July 1st. It looks like he is indeed going to be meeting with Vladimir Putin. Now let's go to some of the economic data we are expecting later today. We are a little under 3 hours away from the June jobs report, expected to have a pretty major impact on the possibility of a rate cut at that September Fed meeting. To preview the data, Bloomberg's Michael McKee joins us this morning. Mike, walk us through what we can expect today.
Well, Kriti, I can tell you what economists expect and the street expects, but what do we actually get is going to be an interesting open question. Right now, the consensus of economists is 190,000 jobs were created during the month of June. Some people think a lot of those part-time work. The unemployment rate isn't expected to change, expected to hang at 4%. And average hourly earnings are expected to tick down just a little bit, and on a year-over-year basis come up at 3.9%. And the decline would be good news for the Fed there. They've been worried about inflation in wages continuing to push inflation higher. But take a look at what has happened the last couple of times. In particular, last month, the forecast consensus from economists was 180,000 jobs. The whisper number on Wall Street was 168,000 jobs. So Wall Street was more pessimistic than the economists, as they are today. But look what we got, 272,000. So we could be in for another upside surprise. Nobody really knows how to forecast the labor market these days.
I mean, Mike, I got to say props to you for showing up on the Friday after the 4th of July. A lot of folks are saying, though, that there aren't that many people at their desks actually trading this. The eyes are really all going to CPI on Tuesday. What do you make of that?
Well, that's certainly the case. The holiday coincides with the jobs report every so often, and we do get more volatility on those days because there's less volume traded. A lot may depend on what happens with unemployment this time, because that's what the Fed is looking at. There's something called the Sahm rule. Claudia Sahm, former Fed economist, came up with that when we see the 3-month moving average of unemployment half a percentage point above the lowest 3-month moving average of the prior 12 months, it triggers a recession. And it's kind of always worked. But you can see how close we are to that level right now, although it would probably take about a 4.4% unemployment rate for us to get there. But if we did get there or got really close to it, it would make people on Wall Street nervous and would drive a lot of trading, at least on Monday after today. But then you're right, the CPI is what people are concerned about because it's the inflation that the Fed has been worried about. If that continues to come down, particularly if we get a weak result today, then that'll certainly increase the odds of a Fed rate move in September, according to Wall Street.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael McKee. We will leave it there. Of course, all eyes on the payrolls report. He'll have full coverage for us coming up at about 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. We thank him so much. Of course, as we watch for that market reaction, at least that's been the conversation here in Europe. What impacts the markets more? Is it going to be simply the geopolitics that you're seeing, the change in government here in the UK, or that anticipation ahead of the French election as well? That puts that at direct conflict with the payroll story as well. Eurodollar is my favorite pair to look at for there. 108.26 is where we're at there. Seeing some strength into the euro. Does that payrolls number picture change that, specifically as we talk about those bids into the dollar, or perhaps not, based on whether or not cuts are indeed priced in? A quick check on some of the other metrics as well. FTSE 100 higher by 0.2% off of the heels of that labor victory. But look, it is light liquidity, light volume. It is the normal that we tend to see post-holiday as well. So really take that kind of autopilot story in regard. S&P futures virtually unchanged as well. 55.92 is another one that we have to keep an eye on. As we talk about the geopolitics and the politics, of course, on this side of the Atlantic, I should also mention that Keir Starmer is expected to speak in about 90 minutes. So we just heard from Rishi Sunak leaving 10 Downing Street. He and as well talking about not only leaving the prime minister role, but also also stepping down as leader of the Conservative Party. Now we're going to hear from Keir Starmer as he moves in to 10 Downing Street, what he means for the first 100 days. We're going to be talking about the relationship with Europe, talking about planning in terms of housing. We'll also be talking about deregulating some of those financial services and how the market all prices it in. Now, before I leave you, I just want to quickly mention it is the largest European banking deal we've seen. BBVA has, of course, approved that capital increase for their Sabadell takeover. We will keep you apprised of all the headlines and more. That does it for Bloomberg Brief. Surveillance is ahead with Manis and Danny. Context matters on Bloomberg.